Welcome to Healing with the Enneagram, a series in which I talk to a range of different Enneagram practitioners about how they incorporate the Enneagram into their healing work. I'm Samantha Mackay, an unconventional life coach and Enneagram practitioner certified by the Chestnut Paes Enneagram Academy. I spent 15 years healing from chronic stress, anxiety, depression, pain, an autoimmune condition, and in the last few years, tending to my own trauma. I believe that when it comes to healing, understanding the role of our ego and our inner protection system is key, which is one of the reasons I'm so passionate about how we incorporate the Enneagram into our healing work. Today, I'm chatting with Carolyn Swora, a leadership development coach and consultant, author of the book Evolve, The Path to Trauma-Informed Leadership, and host of the Evolve podcast. We're talking about how we can use the Enneagram to help heal our relationship with work and being aware of how we all bring trauma into the workplace, even in some of the behaviors that seem so normalized, it's hard to believe that there might be trauma behind them. Carolyn uses the center of intelligence aspect of the Enneagram to help leaders create a more balanced approach to work, but we don't dive into the details of that. So I highly recommend reading her book. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. As we start to talk about healing with the Enneagram, a topic that's really fascinated with me is healing our relationship with work, because I burnt out several times. I love work, but I also found it really challenging at times. And so I'm really excited to talk to Carolyn Swora today, who is an Enneagram professional, and her book, Evolve, The Path to Trauma-Informed Leadership. I'm partway through at the moment, and it is just a great read. And I'm loving the fact we're bringing this topic into the workplace. So thank you for doing that. And thank you for chatting with me today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It's my pleasure, Samantha. Thank you for having me on.
So, what gave you the idea to start thinking about trauma through the lens of how we go to work every day?
The fact that I went to a retreat with B. Chestnut near Paes, and it happened during the pandemic. I was in a space where I had privilege and I was able to do some inner work. And I went to one of their retreats. I'd already been trained professionally through another organization. And it really just opened up my eyes at how stuck I was in seeing the world through my lens of my type. And that just opened the door for exploration and reflection for me. And then I just sort of took it from there and linked it to some of the other work that I'd been doing with organizations through leadership work and culture work. And then it just kind of continued to go from there. I don't know if you want all that detail, but there was some pain in my life and just involving, some relationships with my loved ones that just it wasn't horrible, but just something just didn't feel right. And so I went down that rabbit hole and learned a whole lot of things about myself.
I understand that rabbit hole well.
Yeah.
And like work has become central to our lives, possibly too central, I think, at times. And as
Yeah.
I was reading your book last night, it reminded me that some of the behaviors that we almost considered normalized and appropriate at work can be rooted in trauma in the way we don't
Yeah.
realize and appreciate. And not just trauma, but it's a disconnection from the body or from our three centers of intelligence. And
Yes.
and there's a few different things going on here. And I know that some people listening it might think, well, I don't have trauma.
Well, let's go back to what you just said was work has become sort of central and sort of our over focus on work. I think that that's happened for decades.
Mm,
We just were in a system that really prioritized it and glamorized it. And, I'm, born in the 70s, in the early 70s. My mom raised me. So I saw my mom working hard, although she worked in a hospital. So it's not like she brought, the patients home at night or the work that she did. But that's an important piece to this story because I grew up with a very strong desire to succeed and do well and be ambitious.
mm,
And that involved playing a lot of roles. And what I didn't understand were the systemic sort of pressures behind it.
mm.
So I just played to win everywhere I went. And I'm sure lots of your listeners can relate to that, regardless of gender. It's just you play to win, you play to win, you work harder, you work harder, you work harder, which again is a, I'm a white woman. It's a privileged place to come from, is if you work harder, you'll do better. And so I carried that through my teens. I carried that through my 20s and then into my 30s, into my 40s. And then it's just like, well, this is just how the world is, isn't it?
Mm.
And it's not. And that was, learning the Enneagram. And, for me, the typing, yes, is amazing. And the subtyping, I think for me, when I learned it, I went into this rabbit hole and loved it and wanted to know every single detail, which if some clients want to go there, great. But for me, I thought, how can we take these concepts of centers of intelligence? Because that's a little easier to understand, head,
Mm,
heart, and body. And what's new in there that we could bring into the conversation about leadership?
mm,
And so for me, it was the integration of those three that we have a dominant place we come from. And the second piece was just how disconnected I was from my body center. And so that led me into connecting this work with another piece of work that I do a lot of, which is Dare to Lead. So I'm a certified Dare to Lead practitioner with Brene
mm,
Brown's work. And in her work, she talks about armor.
mm,
And there were 16 pieces of armor, which is self-protective behavior, which comes up from fear. And so piecing all these things together, I had this real realization that, oh, all that hustling for my work, all that volunteering to do everything was not a
mm,
sign of ambition. It was more a sign of I have to insert myself everywhere because I don't know how people love me or value me or respect me. And
mm,
and then that again, that just I just went further into the research. And there's a bunch of different behaviors, but suffice to say, most of the behaviors we get rewarded for, working late, working harder, multitasking, volunteering for extra jobs, really making sure that you are polished and ready to go for any question that comes your way in that big presentation. Those can be really, really unproductive behaviors because they can feed that passion, that emotional pattern within us that just seeks to take more and more and more. And then we just get wound up on it and we burn out. And
mm,
I don't have to tell you, I'm sure in your country it's the
mm.
same as it is here in Canada. Rates of burnout are at all-time high,
The job I burned out was from the one I loved the most,
right?
which I don't doesn't seem shocking to me because
Yeah,
you person is trying to get that job to fulfill some sort of hole within you. And so you just keep
right.
working harder and harder in a cycle that actually can never be fulfilled.
Yeah.
There's always an emptiness to it in
And
some.
and interesting that point. I worked in big corporations and I thought when I left, like, oh, great, like this burnout thing of the past because I was working for somebody else. But to your point, what I learned was you can burn out just as easily in your own business. In fact, there's probably more propensity for it because you never leave it. Right? You
Mm,
go to bed with it every night. Like, do I have enough money to pay XYZ? Like there's a closer relationship with it. And so those boundaries become more blurred. And then especially during the pandemic, when we're confined to our house, those boundaries between work and home become even, well, not even blurred, sort of intersect. And so that's where if we're not aware of that passion of the vice that's like that emotional pattern that's hooking us in, we can just think we have to do more and more and more and more. And there's no end line to that.
mm. And
Yeah,
presumably more and more and more just looks different through each lens, through each passion.
exactly.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
I can imagine, twos and threes and sevens doing more very easily. But then I think, well, how would the five do more? Because we think of them as withdrawing. And I know a lot of people think of the nines as being sloth-like, or actually they're incredibly hard workers. Um,
Exactly. Like, I mean, I see the type nines as probably more, I'm just looking at, I have what I call these armor cards. So they have these sort of
ah,
unproductive behaviors. Type nines, in my experience, have been the hardest to recognize. The sloth, because I mean, the word itself sounds, I have a friend of mine who hates the word sloth. She's a nine. They have had a harder time seeing it. And so I find they can get lost very easily in team dynamics and team and collaboration because it's
mm,
always about everybody else. And type fives, they can get lost in information and knowledge and get lost in their heads. And so
mm,
that's where I see the pattern spinning there. I just need more data. I just need more data, and
mm.
and reluctant to make decisions or getting stuck in the uncertainty.
And so how does this piece around the centers of intelligence and then trauma come in underneath these behaviors of getting lost or overworking and overdoing.
So we need to kind of tie those three things
Yeah,
together.
because I see how we live in a culture that reinforces this work is central. And so then
Yep.
for where there is a need to succeed at work reinforced culturally. And then
Right.
there's something our ego needs to fulfill. And then there's this piece inside of us that then twists around.
Yep. Yep. So when we are unconscious to these patterns, they just carry on, right? They just carry on, and we keep, I as a type 2 will just keep people pleasing and helping out wherever I can. And that's really admired. I mean, who would have thought? Well, I didn't think, who would have thought that helping others and really inserting yourself into other people's business to help them out, who would have thought that that was
Mm.
egoic? I certainly see it now, and I certainly see how destructive and damaging it was. Here's how that links to trauma. Here's what I've learned is one's ability to recognize the pattern is impacted by how much trauma we've had in our life. And here's
One's
why.
ability to recognize the pattern is correlated with how much trauma we've had.
That's a strong word.
Mm-hmm.
Correlated. I'm going to just say impacted because I can't actually cite a reference for that. Maybe so just the correlation between it. So my ability to recognize these seemingly productive behaviors to make me seem successful in our world, my ability to recognize that they were harmful to me was impaired by the trauma that I've had in my life.
Okay.
So just think of it as stuck. It just makes it extra hard to unpack and understand. Like, what do you mean? Like helping people. Again, I'll just come back to, the vice of a type 2 and the virtue of humility. It was like, wait a sec, I'm humble. Like, what are you talking about? So,
Mm.
it took some really deep work to get under that, and really, really painful work too. So let's tie in this concept of trauma. Just like to simply state it, trauma, if any of you listening grew up in the 70s, 80s, or 90s, your thoughts about trauma are going to be informed by some really, really, really old research, which was that trauma is an event. And if you're tough enough, you can survive that event. So don't worry about it. We're all good, right? There's so much more research now and so much more work that has been done in this field that is really, really proving that trauma is not a cognitive process. It's not an event either. Trauma is in a really simple way, I love the way Gabor Mate says it, is it's an emotional wound. It's our body's really incredible reaction to protect us when we don't have the resources to protect ourselves in the wake of a really, really emotionally impactful or disturbing event that happens to us. So our brain holds on to this disturbance and it gets stored in our body. And if we don't learn how to process it, it gets stuck there. And the place where it gets stuck in our brain has no concept of time. So
Mm.
I had a dad who was pretty aggressive. He drank. And so anger would come out. So my brain doesn't remember that, the time of that would have been in the 70s and the 80s. I'm in a boardroom and a male leader who's, 50 or 60 gets really upset and angry about something. Okay, that's fine. Anger can be a healthy emotion. My brain, though, has stored these memories that that's not going to be safe, Carolyn, because when so and so gets angry, when your dad gets angry, that's going to result in some very dire consequences.
Mm.
So my ability to perform at work was unknowingly impacted by the trauma that was stored in my body. It's nothing to do with how strong you are, like willpower, any of that. I won't get into all the science of it. I'm not a therapist, but I am definitely informed. And what that means is that we're going to have reactions in our workplaces personally and with others that are symptoms of unresolved hurt earlier in our life, if we don't want to use the word trauma. And I thought for years that I could just run from my past. That's actually one of the names of the chapters in the book, or the title of one of the chapters is Your Fast Isn't Too Far Behind You, or Your Fast Isn't as Far Away as You Think It Is. I just thought I could sweep all of that challenging stuff with my dad under a carpet. And when he passed away, it was like, no, 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 we're all good.
Mm.
It's all gone. And it wasn't. And it just showed up in different ways as I got older.
I like how you said instead of the words trauma, we can just say wounds or hurts we haven't tended to yet.
Yeah. And let's so here's the other thing. If we look at that terminology, this is why I really appreciate Gabor Mate's work in the
Mm.
simplicity of the emotional wound. There's no judgment there. I think it's pretty easy for us all to remember as children a moment where something really hurt us. And it might have seemed to be something like, I remember being made fun of because I had freckles, or which you can't really see on Zoom, but or red hair, or just like feeling different, right?
Mm.
And so the emotional wounding of being really tall in grade 2 might not seem like a big deal to some people, but fact is, if I didn't have the resources, if I didn't have friends, if I didn't have a loving parent at home, that could really, really deeply impact my sense of self. So
Mm.
trauma really separates us from who we are because we have to learn to dissociate because it's not safe to be who we are.
Mm.
So, everybody does have some level of emotional wounding.
Mm.
And when you get really deep into the research, everybody does have a level of trauma that they're working through, or I shouldn't say working through, they have a level of trauma that's impacted them at some point in their life.
Mm.
And the other thing too, by saying it's an emotional wound or, having a difficult past, is I find it really lessens this comparison thing, like, oh, your trauma is worse than mine, or oh, I can understand why you're like that because that must have been difficult. Meanwhile, if somebody says something that might not seem as difficult to them, they can get into comparison, and
Mm.
there's no comparison needed with trauma. Like, it's not, we've all had
No.
difficulty, and there's no benefit to comparing. Comparison is the thief of joy, so we don't need to go there.
Mm. And I think what I like about it I mean, I think trauma gives it more weight, but just saying it's an emotional wound seems so obvious that we can't leave that at the door when we get to work. Because I think
Right.
part of the 80s and 90s, even beyond, where it's meant to, leave your emotions at the door. We don't
Yep.
bring emotions to work.
Yep.
None of this triggering nonsense. No, everyone's just, automatons in the office. And
Yeah.
that just seems so disingenuous and illogical to me that I found it really hard to reconcile what work was meant to be, because we are these emotional beings and we do bring all that wounding into work, whether we want to or not. And work will trigger us.
Like, you're exactly right. And as a type 2, it gave me understanding as to why I got so emotional. And it was really hard. Like, I literally had to dissociate this whole piece of me that was really, really emotional, and but yet this like performer and needing to achieve. And so, and we can go back into the history, which we don't need to, but that just got more and more reinforced. So learning the Enneagram helped me honor that piece of me, and then understanding that there's that there's body wisdom, that there's a center of
Mm.
intelligence that was virtually untouched,
Mm.
in my consciousness, has truly given me an opportunity to integrate and access the knowledge that each of these centers of intelligence hold.
Mm.
And so it was a real eye opener. Like, body wisdom, nobody talks about that at work for a variety of reasons. And I think there's just so much we can learn from that, because I've had a strong intuition, and I know intuition's not the same as body wisdom,
Mm.
but just recognizing that there is all this amazing wisdom that we're not
Mm.
accessing when we're stuck in our dominant center of intelligence, whatever that one is for you.
Mm. And I think it's really interesting. So there's two things at play here. Culturally, we've been living in a very head-centered world for a long time. And the
Yep.
concept of the emotional center of intelligence has really only been on the rise in the last 50, 60, or so years. And then
Yep.
somatic intelligence, I feel like it's only in the last sort of decade or 2 decades or so. It's still very new.
Yep.
When I read the book Braining 10 or so years ago and learned that we actually have three actual brains in our body and how much they govern us even when we don't realize it, I
Yep.
found that really insightful. But it didn't necessarily make the link to thinking about how could we use the body intelligence in the workplace. So I'm really curious about how you've made that leap and what you're seeing and how we
Yeah.
can use the body to help us start to heal our relationship to work.
So in my training, when I was being trained by Brene Brown as a certified Dare to Lead facilitator, she made this statement and I wrote it down and I went back and looked at my notes when I was writing my book. And I don't even remember writing this down,
Mm.
but clearly somewhere it was landing in my consciousness. And it had highlights, had stars, in my note taking. It was like, this is really important, Carolyn. And it said, one of the greatest casualties of trauma is the inability to be vulnerable. And by that point, I'd already written a book, got a master's in industrial and organizational psychology. So I knew all the right academic things. But when I went back and saw that statement, I thought, well, damn, if we're teaching people to be vulnerable at work, does it not make sense, Carolyn, to understand a bit more about trauma? And I had at that point I had a draft of a book, my second book, and it was going to be written to my sons who are 19 and 20. And it was called The Perfect Widow. And it was a book about the grief, the story that, sort of our past. And I wanted to I don't want to say put it, I wanted to heal it. I didn't have that word at the time though. I wanted to heal it. And my coach at the time said, Carolyn, I think there's something more in that book that you haven't touched into. So I really, really valued her wisdom. And so I went back into it and I started aligning the concepts that I'd been learning about trauma. And instead of writing it as a memoir, I took that insight and blended it with my culture and leadership work. And then I had a personal situation happen where some really old hurt showed up with tears one day, and I had no idea where it came from. And a friend of mine just said, the word trauma informed. I was like, what? That's what are you talking about? And I just thought, it's being trauma informed is more prevalent, like that language is more prevalent in education and healthcare. I'm sure you see the same thing. Our corporate spaces don't use those words.
Mm.
And yet people are going to work every day. So are we going to be real folks or not? And so with the title of the book, I wanted to intentionally position it as and use that word trauma and really invite people in to understand that there's a third way, which is the way of the body, and that our body holds all this untapped wisdom. And the more we ignore it, the more we ignore trauma, the further we are going to be away from really creating a better world, and a world that honors the land and honors people and really has a full integration of who we are as humans. So trauma lives in our body. Our body center gets impacted, obviously, but really it impacts our ability to see the patterns of our behavior, the shadow sides and those sorts of things for obvious reasons, right? We've been trying to protect ourselves.
Maybe it might be useful to like define or sort of explain what the body center is.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I went kind of geeky and really dug into the nervous system, right? So the nervous system, our five senses, gives us information. So if we have a dominant, well, not even if we have a dominant, that center of intelligence gives us data through our nervous system, through our spinal cord and our brain. And it can cause us to act really instinctively. And our body knows how to protect us. So that's a beautiful thing about a body center. And when you integrate that with our head center, which values objectivity and data and facts, and then you bring in the emotional, relational, heart base, like what an amazing combination of skills to have as a human, let alone, or a leader, let alone a human. Because then we can tap into each of those centers as needed. So this notion of the nervous system bringing us data, I got even more curious again. And I'm a bit of I love learning, I love school. So I really started studying Stephen Porges's polyvagal theory, which really changed how people looked at the nervous system. So most of us will know sympathetic which is the fight or flight, and parasympathetic, which is rest and digest.
Mm.
What his theory discovered, and it was published in 1995 for the first time, was that it's not as straightforward as that. That in fact, there are different elements, there's different branches to this parasympathetic nerve. It's not just about rest and digest, there's this other element that involves shutting down and going into a state where we need to conserve all of our resources. So in fact, what I've learned through polyvagal theory is, I think, so applicable to leadership. In essence, our nervous systems are going to be communicating or co-regulating at all times, regardless of what our head thinks, regardless of what our heart is feeling. There are these signals that go on between our nervous systems, and that is body wisdom at its core, at its essence, because we can't change the body wisdom through our head or our heart. We have to learn how to resource our system, our body system, so that the data that we take in is clean and free from static or confusion. And when there's trauma in our bodies, there's going to be static or confusion or like interruptions in the flow of data. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense, actually.
And really simply, here's an example of how I think polyvagal theory can help leaders. I have a big meeting planned, let's say, or here's another one. I have to give performance evaluations, which I can't stand the performance appraisal systems in most companies, but let's just go with the reality of what's existing in business. And I have had a really, really long night with a toddler, let's say, or maybe I've had a big fight with my partner. And I come into work the next morning and I am wired. Either don't want to talk to anybody, or maybe if I'm a type 8, I'm going to have a lot of outward energy. This is like those types of behaviors are more associated with what we call a sympathetic state, which is sort of fight or flight. So there's energy. There's energy. How do you think the other person in the room, their nervous system is going to feel that energy? And you have to come in, let's say it's you and I, and you've got a manager who's just like kind of buzzing. You can feel that. And now you've got to talk about your performance review for the year. Regardless if you've had a good year or a shitty year, it's still going to be activating because it's like, oh, okay, wait, they're on alert. So I need to be on alert too. So as leaders, one, recognizing that. And so how can we bring ourselves, how can we find cues of safety so that our brain is like, oh, okay, yeah, that was a hard night last night, or I'm really tired, or yeah, I'm still feeling really activated from that conversation with my partner. What are some cues of safety that can just tell my brain, we're good here right now. We're not still in that conversation. Or what are some practices that I can do to resource my body and tell my brain I'm okay? And this is where breathing comes in, the simple act of intentional breathing. So you could do something like cyclic sighing, which is 2 inhales and then a really long exhale, right? Because it's ideally, maybe if you've had a really bad night, you reschedule everything, but I know that's not always an option. But, pausing and recognizing like, oh gosh, I'm going to have this employee, this person come in, and human to human, this is not going to be a good experience. I owe it to myself and my colleague to just bring myself down a little bit. And even, maybe if you came in just saying, hey, listen, I just want you to know I'm a little amped up. Please give me some feedback if it's a little too intense, or like just inviting in and setting the tone, recognizing and resourcing ourselves. I think it's something that a lot of leaders would welcome and value and understand. And the goal isn't to always be in, what's called a ventral vagal state, or like a green state where we're feeling really flowy. It's really about knowing the state that you're in and learning how to resource yourself so that you're in the right state for the right function as best as you can.
I like that concept of resourcing because we rarely get to be green all the time. It's not how life works. Life comes with
Exactly.
stresses, and we never know what's going to trigger us and or
Yeah.
activate us in the next minute. So what are some other ways we can, once we've identified that we need some resourcing, so we can breathe, we can let
Yep.
people know that we're activated. That's
Yep.
two types of resourcing. We can cancel all our meetings, give us some more
Yep.
capacity. What
Yep.
other things can we do?
Yeah. So really what you want to do is you want your body to recognize that it's here in the now and that it's
Mm,
safe.
mm,
And so this is where cues of safety, I think even just this language can really, really help leaders. So, what is a cue of safety? And it could be by where you're sitting. It could be, okay, well, look, I don't have anyone coming up behind me. Like I've got a wall here. And even though you might think, oh, Carolyn, that's silly. Of course, no one's coming up behind you. Your brain doesn't know. So just
mm,
like, well, there's no one here. There's no one here. Um, lights can like amplify things so we can see everything. So like everything's lighted here. And just saying to your brain, okay, I'm seeing some things. I'm feeling comfortable. Hey, like my dog is over here. Or if you're in your office, maybe you've got pictures of loved ones. Okay, I'm safe here. I'm safe here. So looking for cues of safety, like I said,
mm,
that really, really is helpful. And we have to tell our brain these things. There's so many things that are really vying for the attention of our brain,
mm,
and it's being bombarded with signals, so just a little bit of space is really helpful for it. You can do things like grounding your feet, putting your feet on the ground, and which like I'm doing right now, and just again a few deep breaths and just connecting yourself in to the steadiness, to the firmness of something beneath you. So you can do the same thing with your chair. Like, okay, I feel my thighs, I can feel my sit bones, I can feel the small of my back leaning against the chair. And just
mm,
I'm supported. I can recognize that. Like, because you don't can't think into the future or the past. You're sitting right
mm,
here, right now. So those are some. Another thing that you can do is you can give yourself just some hand hugs. A colleague of mine, Lisa Burchartz, she taught me that, like just hand hugs. And it's just, a way of like, yep, I feel you. I've got you.
mm,
If you're in a space, like if you can maybe, if you're at work, or you maybe have a moment to yourself in an office or in a bathroom, you can give yourself an embrace and a hug. And again, I used to think this was kind of like, oh, that's sort of soft stuff. Like you don't need to hug yourself. But the act of embracing and touch
mm.
is really does something comforting. And it again tells your brain we're safe.
Well, and that's what I was noticing in all the things you suggested, because I mean, they could easily be dismissed as sort of silly things, but you're using all five senses to bring new information through the nervous system into the body.
Exactly.
Looking at loved ones, you're using sight, touch,
Yep.
smell,
Yeah,
sound, all of these things, we can bring in signals of safety through the body to help
exactly.
the body see that it's not got the whole picture right now.
Yeah. Like essential oils. So I've just started using essential oils and that's your olfactory, your smell.
Mm,
And so certain smells are going to again relax or stimulate.
mm,
So it really is about those five senses. You could even do the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 exercise. Again, you can do this in the middle of a meeting. Okay, what are five things I can see? And I guess you wouldn't name them out loud, but you can maybe write them down. What are four things I can touch? Like, and again, five senses, they can bring you into the moment. If you can't smell something, maybe you can smell somebody, or maybe you can smell your own breath. You can just think of a smell that you really like. And same thing
mhm,
with taste. If you don't have any food in front of you, you can think of like, what's something that I love, like the taste of vanilla or the taste of chocolate. And again, like, how simple are these practices?
mm,
Really, we've just learned to dismiss them. And, you said a few minutes ago, somatic conversations or concepts or ideas about somatic wisdom have really just shown up in the past few decades. I would say they've shown up in our culture and in the corporate space, well, maybe not even the past few decades, but they are recent to many of us, but they have been around for thousands of
mm,
years, right?
mm,
Like from so many cultures, indigenous cultures in particular, really, really, I think are great holders of this wisdom. And so being trauma informed really recognizes that there is all of this wisdom to recognize all of it, and also just brings us into connection with things bigger than ourselves. So
Mm,
the land and protecting the land and honoring everybody and all of the cultures, it really integrates all of these concepts that are finally permeating, we'll say like popular culture.
mm,
And I think it's an exciting time, as sad and as hard as it is in the world.
mm,
It's also an exciting time because we really have an opportunity to heal and
mm,
and move through the world in a different way.
And you've just given me this idea of what the potential of a body-based like company or business could look like.
Yeah.
From a cultural perspective, not just we offer physical based services, but also just what would it be like if organizations where the head center wasn't the primary
Yeah.
vaulted on a pedestal way to approach
Yeah.
things.
And I like to use the word integrated. And that's why I love the centers of intelligence, and why when I was writing Evolve, I had to cut out a whole bunch of stuff. But to me, it was just a really easy way to introduce body wisdom without saying body wisdom, because even I would have been like, whatever, I don't need to know about that. But it really is about integrating and recognizing those three centers. They exist in all of us.
Mm,
So even those people who are body center dominant, the eights, nines, and ones, doesn't mean they're using their body center properly. I mean, they might be cut off in a different way, but it was just a real invitation. So for me, it's when leaders can integrate all three of those centers, use the right center for the right task. And if we have any unresolved difficulties from our past or emotional wounds, we're going to get really, really connected and hooked into our fixations and our vices. And then, then we're on the wheel running and unconsciously harming ourselves and others.
And it's hard to stop running on the wheel, especially when that wheel receives positive reinforcement.
Exactly. And now we're back to all the volunteering for things at work, not having boundaries, feeling bad if I say no to my boss, volunteering for everything, avoiding hard conversations. Like, I don't want to hurt so and so's feelings. So it's okay. It's okay that they talked over me. It's okay.
Mm.
No, it's not okay. It's not
And I think
okay.
when we start to close the loop on how we heal our relationship with work, because I think that first step is the obviously awareness, but then connecting into the body and finding our sense of safety, because then we can make a different choice. To take
Right.
that example, we could then choose to have the hard conversation because we would feel more safety within our bodies. And the more we're able to make different choices, the more we shift
Yep.
our relationship with work, whether that's
Yep.
changing the workplace we're in or finding a workplace that is safer or healthier or less toxic.
Yeah. Yep. You're bang on. It's creating that little bit of space. And the other thing that happens is when we create that little bit of space, there's body wisdom that will surface, that if we're always running and just relying on our head, our intellect, regardless of what our dominant center is, we miss out on a whole lot of spontaneous insight that will just rise. And I didn't really understand that until I started doing my own personal work with the Enneagram. And I can do more work in less time
Mm,
than I could 4 years ago. And it's simply because I'm not fighting those patterns, and I let more space in. I go out for walks. I'm moving, right? Emotion, energy, and motion. I'm able to move things through my body. So my senses are going to be more attuned and more, I guess, exercised, for lack of a better word, but more, yeah, more attuned.
mm. I think sometimes I bring in some of those practices much further down the track. Okay, I'm really triggered now. Okay, we really need to use the
Yep.
butterfly hug or the self massage or whatever it is. But
Yep.
even just, I'm thinking about how do I include smaller signals of safety
Yep.
that are just existing around on a regular basis, such as the photos of loved ones or something
Yep.
else, becomes more part of the everyday norm as
Yep.
opposed to waiting for me to notice that actually, we're really activated here. We need to do something about it.
Totally. Because by the time that's showing up for you, you've likely missed a whole lot of other subtle signals. There's another great one too, like, the butterfly and just tapping your chest.
Mm.
Tapping, I don't practice tapping, but I know there's a pattern. Again, it's sensorial.
Mm.
And breathing is the fastest way to talk to your brain. It's where those three, so in our sinoatrial point in our heart is where the sympathetic nervous system and the two ventral and dorsal vagal elements of our nervous system, they all connect right there, which means we can just communicate to our brain really quickly. And you do that by breathing deep, long breaths, because when you're in a state of threat, you can't breathe that way. So it just tells your brain, all good.
And I think the question I've got at the moment is, I know that some people find breathing in itself triggering for various reasons.
Yes.
What do you
Yep.
suggest in those situations?
It's a great point. It's a great point. If that happens, don't you always need to follow your own body's direction. So never trust somebody else. And if it's feeling too activating, then breathe in a way that feels safe for you with intention. Like, I'm going to
Mm.
take 5 breaths right now. Letting a longer exhale out can also, like, whatever that might be, like a short inhale of 1 and then exhale of 3. So really trying to get more exhale out. If that is feeling too activating, sometimes if we start by giving ourselves some safety through touch, that might open up the breathing to feel a little bit more comfortable. And if not, that's okay. That's okay. This is where if you feel really activated by breathing, I would definitely say it would be a value to work with a professional in somatic experience or somebody who's trained in some of these somatic modalities to help you dig under it, because it's your body's way of saying, I've got too much going on here. This isn't feeling safe.
That makes a lot of sense. Firstly, just looking at different ways to breathe, but if it's not possible to find a way that feel safe to breathe, then it's
Yeah.
definitely an indication that some sort of professional support would be beneficial.
I think so. And also just to accept it for what it is. And
Mm.
instead of like, oh, everyone else is doing it, like, what's wrong with me? Right? Like, thank you, body. Thank you for protecting me.
Mm.
There's something going on here. I hear you.
I
So,
really appreciate that. And I've loved this whole conversation about
yeah.
like how we bring this sense of safety into ourselves and then into our workplace, because yeah, I think there's a lot of work to do to really start to change how work happens.
Yeah.
And I think trauma and understanding that is a really important part. And so I'm really pleased that you're shouting that from the rooftops, both through
I
your book and
am.
all your promotional work and all the pieces, because
Yeah.
it's so essential. And I think it's a huge missing piece. And so
Yeah.
thank you for bringing that to light.
Well, thank you for reading my work and all the work that you do as well, because I think all these different pieces that encourage us all to deepen our self-awareness, even a little tiny bit, can really help us bring a different level of consciousness to our actions and really
Mm.
align our intent with our impact.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Samantha.